Hi, everybody. Welcome to class. Today we're going to talk about continuity and change in social problems. Essentially, through a different language, what the book is talking about in this section of the chapter is social construction or a social constructionist approach. So what is a social construction? A social construction is the creation of a ideology, fact, phenomenon, and even sometimes a perspective on an object. So a social construction is something that we all agree to be real. It does not have to necessarily be real um, to be real in its consequences once it becomes a social fact. So social construction is a very strong ideology widely held by a society or a culture in a certain time and place. So our think, pair, share for today is what are the key elements that you would use to identify if something is a social construct? There are a particular set of rules here. What is a social constructionist approach? And in the effort to create something as a social problem, social movements move through 4 stages. What are those 4 stages? So a social construction, or what we would in sociology call the social construction of reality, is any definition of a situation or a concept. It can be both objective and subjective. It's a definition in that it's widely held by a society, a culture, and its time and place. Social constructs change over time. That's what differs them from facts. And they can change from place to place. So we can identify something as a social construct because it changes over time and it changes from place to place, and it does not need to be real in fact to be real in its consequences. A great example of a social construct is race. Race, biologically speaking, or what people consider different blood racial groups, is not real. Biologists do not believe that race as we perceive it in our everyday culture is real. It would be more akin, their definition of race is more akin to what we think of as ethnicity. So it's a group of people who identify in a similar racial category or group, and they are related by population, um, population, and language and geographic area. So where they live, the language they speak, and how they identify themselves. What we think of as a racial group, and what you might get back when you take one of those tests to find out your racial background, is what a biologist would consider a population. So populations to them are essentially what we consider to be racial groups, and that's how they identify it. Now, that being said, racial groups and racial categories are very real in their consequences. They may not be biologically real or distinct, but they are extremely real in the consequences for human beings, groups of societies, and individuals. Um, Now, all types of things influence our definitions of social constructions. So the institutions that are most likely to influence a social construction is the government, so policies, laws, that type of things. As we create laws, our ideas about social construction of an idea or an ideology or a value that we hold, they change. The media has a huge impact on our social construction of reality. Wolfgang, stop, please. Um, the way that we perceive reality, our identities, even how we perceive an event, that changes based on how the media that we consume talks about it. Elites largely control both our economy, and we're talking about real elites. We're talking about that top 1% of society who owns about 80% of the wealth. They largely control government policies and laws. They mostly own those media organizations. But any institution can shape ideology. One of our first institutions of impact is family. They're the first group or institution to socialize us, and they largely shape our ideas and our social construction of reality. But just like government and media, education, the healthcare system, religion, those all shape our social construction of reality. We can socially construct our realities through interactions with others. That is what we would consider to be norms, values, and mores. So a norm is an everyday rule. Think standing in line or breaking a rule. A norm would be to cut in line. A value is a little more held, like strongly held norm. So a value is be honest, be fair, right? Those are values in our society. Work hard. And we tend to all kind of agree that those are kind of typical American values. A more is a value that is so strongly held, we are likely to create a law around it. And we're likely to punish you or even ostracize you or remove you from society if you break that law. So think pedophilia, right? So that would be breaking a more. It's so strongly held in our society. Our incest taboos, our pedophilia taboos, eating other human beings, that would be a huge more breaking, right? It would be breaking a more. And once again, those socially constructed ideas in our society, they can change over time. They can change from one geographic location to another, and they can have very real consequences even if they aren't real. It can be a little bit tricky. A river is not a social construction, but a river as a boundary between two countries is a social construction. So the way that we perceive even something real can be turned into a social construction. So what do we mean when we talk about a social construction of a social problem? Well, something isn't considered a social problem until society considers it a social problem. So we can have those huge fires that we have in Northern California. We can have gigantic, trash and plastic islands in the ocean. We can have huge devastation from climate change. But if we don't believe that climate change is real as a society, and we don't agree as a society that it's a social problem, then it essentially is not a social problem because we have not yet socially constructed it in that way. So a social constructionist would say we need to agree that it's real, even if it has real consequences. If we don't agree that it's real, it's not yet a social problem. So how do we socially construct problems as a social problem? And what do you believe is going on with climate change, and why do so many people not believe climate change is real, even though there is government institutions who say that it's real and the consequences are real? There are a large body of scientists who believe that climate change is real and the consequences are real. And there is also, large organizations like oil companies who take action. They're taking preventative action to prevent their own economic losses due to future climate change. Whenever you see an oil rig that's up really high out of the ocean, you'll notice that oil rigs are built up above the ocean, and so you could see their platform going down. And that's because the oil industry was one of the first to realize that climate change is affecting the level of the ocean. And so they started building their oil rigs up extremely high up on the ocean so that they, when the ocean levels rise, they still have their oil rigs in effect, and they're still usable, and they don't have huge economic losses for that. At the same time, about 10 years after they started doing that, they started promoting what they call a contrary science, and they started hiring scientists to create papers to flood the scientific community with anti-climate change science papers. So here's a picture of the oil rigs, if you were wondering what I was talking about. But so a social constructionist approach would tell you that social problems arise as people define those conditions, right? They need to define those conditions as undesirable, need of change, and they need to acknowledge all of that. So if they think that the change is desirable, it's not a social problem. If they think it's undesirable but doesn't need to be changed, like homelessness, it's not a social problem. Okay, so essentially there are 4 stages to claims making. So how do institutions create a social problem? Well, they need to have the social problem actually emerge. They need to establish legitimacy. They sometimes need to renew the claims making, so bring it forward again. And they may need to decide upon and implement alternative strategy. So anytime a social group, a news media, any type of politician, they draw attention to the conditions or the behavior, for example, climate change, and society starts to agree that it's undesirable, they are making the claim that it's a social problem, and they're trying to influence the public. So that could happen through policy, happens through media, it happens through education. The same thing occurs when people try to make a claim against a social problem. So they'll use the same exact strategies. And legitimacy is the scientific community's research, petitions, and spending attempts. So when money starts to get spent on a problem, it legitimizes that problem. Of course, scientific evidence is going to legitimize it, and the community as a whole, in terms of grassroots organizations and the population, can legitimize it if the movement is large enough. Although, if you look at C. Wright Mills and what C. Wright Mills talks about, he says the weakest of all power structures is the working class population at large. So the masses of people, all of us, we're weaker than, in terms of power to assert what we want, we're weaker than government institutions and the higher ups in the military and those who own all of the wealth. So if though people really want social change, or want to solve a social problem, and the government action doesn't occur, oftentimes those same grassroots organizations or masses of people will then take on that social problem again, and they'll renew their claim for that particular issue being a social problem. And the way that they can do that is they can sometimes redefine their strategy, renew their focus, or develop an alternative strategy. Okay, so if we were in class, we would do an active learning assignment. We're probably going to move this into a Flipgrid assignment. And so what I would ask you to do is to choose a social problem. This would be something akin to your project that you're going to do this semester, but you can use anything. Think about what institution has or is the most influential in making the claim that it's a social problem. Research the subjectivity of the problem. So do you find that the social problem you chose, that policymakers or large numbers of people within society consider it to be a social problem? And is it actually a social problem, right? So do you believe that the problem is subjectively or objectively a social problem? Why or why not? And how many people do you believe have been harmed? So who's being harmed, and how many people? So when I say who, I would say, is it a racial group? Is it like the working class, the poor? Is it men, women, or intersex people? Is it children or the elderly? And then think about, how did you learn about this and if it's a social problem? Okay, so just to review, what were our think, pair, share questions, which are discussion questions for the week. What are the key elements that you would use to identify a social construct? What is a social constructionist approach? And in the efforts to create a social problem, what are the key four stages in creating a social movement? Have a wonderful day. Bye.